Hey guys, I'm Yurouzi. This is the part 10 of What If Naruto and Team 7 was actually trained by Kakashi. Kakashi survived his losses in spirit as well as in body, and having learned both wisdom and intellect from his experiences, he now seeks to pass those traits on to his students. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 39, From the Darkness, It Speaks. I'm sorry. Naruto kept glancing at the floor, only to look up at Choji again, usually at the big-boned boy's arm. The medic Nin had swapped the splint for a full cast, which ran from the boy's hand to just past the elbow, immobilizing the arm almost entirely. The large genin shrugged, then grimaced when the movement jostled his arm. It's okay, Naruto, he said, his voice cheerful in spite of the pain. You got me fair and square, and it's not like I won't heal. The medic says it's a line fracture, it'll only take a few days to heal with their help. They could have done it without the cast, but they seemed very worried they would need all their chakra for healing after the final fight. They both shuddered. Neither one had forgotten what had happened in the Forest of Death. Choji may not have seen it, but he still got the chills just from how Naruto had reacted when his clone gave him the memory of Gaara slaughtering another team. Naruto glanced at the door leaving the medical ward, his gaze unfocused, distant. Choji reached out with his good arm and gave Naruto a pat on the shoulder. They'll be fine, he said, trying to keep the mood light. I'm sure they'll give up before they get hurt. Naruto nodded, but he did not agree. Hiruzen noticed that his fellow leaders were slowly changing their mannerisms as they waited for the final match. Raza was acting nervous. He carried his end of the conversation well enough, but with every word he got more and more distracted. He kept looking at the arena floor, where his son Gaara stood. The boy had come out the moment the final match had been announced, and was simply standing there, waiting. He had ignored the wooden structure being raised in the middle, not even watching as the single ANBU had made a few seals and started growing it out of the ground in front of him. Not once had the boy turned to look at his father, and yet Raza kept glancing at the boy. Orochimaru was distracted too, but where Raza acted nervous, the Sannin seemed to be growing excited. Hiruzen had trouble accepting the very idea. Orochimaru had never shown excitement before, not over a new jutsu, not over the prospect of a mission. Nothing. It was almost alarming, seeing Orochimaru slowly edging forward in his seat, one tiny move at a time, like a child expecting a present. You look ready to hop into the ring yourself, Orochimaru, the Hokage said with a wry smile, his eyes watching every move of his former student as he spoke. Orochimaru sat up slightly, and for a moment, he gave the impression of embarrassment. But his sardonic smile came back, and he waved a hand dismissively. I would be lying if I said I was not looking forward to this match. This very match might determine the future of our various villages, one way or another. You hardly have a stake in this, grumbled Raza, who had returned to staring at his son. On the contrary, said the Sannin. True, I have no genin in the test, at least not anymore. He ignored Hiruzen's glower and carried on. But this whole thing will certainly change the world in small ways, and what goes around comes around. The three of us are at war, a war of economics, and I have good cause to believe I shall win this match. He pointed down at the arena where Gaara was waiting. I imagine that your boy there will win, and in doing so, he will crush his foes viciously. Between his own bloodthirst and his obvious disdain for authority, however, I get the feeling that his win will push away those who might want shinobi for purposes other than wholesale slaughter. Why hire a creature who will gladly kill as it sees fit, and thus risk drawing its attention? He pointed again, this time to one side where the three Konohagakure genin were coming out of the competitor's doorway. And if they win, then it will be good for you, Hokage, because they will live, but it will have taken 3 of Konoha's genin to match soon as one. And while Konohagakure pushes teamwork, not everyone wants to pay for a team. He leaned back, a large smirk on his face, and closed his eyes to bask in the sun like his namesake. And then there is me, the up-and-coming leader of a small and new village. I have no remaining competitors, but the one I had was so deep in Konohagakure ranks that he reached the exams without notice. I am famed for my efficiency and cunning. When the winner makes their village look like a failure, where will the business go? To the loser? Or to the unknown who managed to sneak his people right out of the most powerful village of them all? He opened one eye and gave Hiruzen a cheeky wink, then slouched and basked in the warm glow of both the sun and the fury of his two fellow leaders. I hope your genin win, he said, turning his face toward the Hokage without opening his eyes. You've already lost this round, when it comes to our little battle of wits. At least if they win, they live. It's a sort of victory, yes? Hiruzen grumbled and leaned forward in his seat, looking down at the place where the fate of villages was often decided, and mentally cursed his wayward former student. Are you sure about this? Asked Sakura, palming a small roll of paper and looking at Sasuke, her eyes alight with adrenaline and fear and above all else a passion to win. Sasuke nodded. We can't take him with brute force. Hitting him is likely impossible, and both of you are focused mostly on taijutsu and short-range techniques. This is about the only chance we have. Hinata tapped her fingers, a nervous habit that still made its way out from time to time, then seemed to notice her actions and let her hands fall to her sides. What if this does not work? She asked, putting voice to the thought they all shared. Sasuke shrugged and pulled down his goggles as they reached the door into the arena. Then we do what our sensei said and quit. Dead genin are even less useful than disgraced genin. Gaara didn't even bother looking at all three of the genin opposing him, arrayed with one at each corner of the roof. His eyes fell only on one target, driven by his mother's will. The one with the dark hair and white eyes was almost dripping with delicious fear. Normally, Mother would have been slavering to get at her, but for now, Mother did not care. The one in pink was tightening her gloves. Her pet was missing, and by the look in her eyes, that was probably intentional. Gaara figured she would fight hard, but when the time came, she'd scream and beg like the rest. Mother liked screaming, but for now, Mother didn't care. The one with the black hair and goggles held all of Mother's attention. He looked like the sort of self-confident shinobi who thought they knew everything. Gaara had watched the boys' previous matches, and knew he had a solid grasp of tactics and a great deal of self-assurance. The girls might scream, but this boy, this Sasuke, would feel true horror when Mother got him in her murderous grasp. His breath came in eager gasps and he waited for the proctor to start the match. His father had threatened dire punishments if he overstepped his bounds during this trip, but as for that. He looked up, for the first time since the break was announced, and met the eyes of his father. He then gave the older man a big, happy grin before returning his attention to his targets. He won't stand in my way this time, he thought, his grin only growing as Mother growled her assent. The proctor raised his hand and then dropped it. Gaara's sand whirled about him, one great blast of sand, raised to deflect the inevitable kunai every shinobi launched. But he saw no attack, and after a moment, the sand settled into a ring on the floor around him, revealing his still unmoving foes. Well? He asked, staring at them. I know you three are going to try and take me out first. Why delay? I'm waiting. Prove my existence. He raised his hands, his sand flying up with his command and flowing towards the boy, then stopped. The boy still had not moved. Neither had the girls. More fakes. More illusions. Even the boy will not stand and face me. No, said Gaara, shaking his head as most of his sand started to collect in the middle of the roof. No, we're not playing this game. I'm not going to follow you into the building for you to trap and play tag with me. I'm tired of waiting, tired of hiding, and so tired of holding back. I want blood, damn you. Mother wants blood. And she'll have it. He raised his arms high, and the sand pulled itself into the air, forming a large wedge. No. More. Hiding, the wedge did not split the building. It obliterated it. It drove through the roof like it was made of wax. The moment it entered the building, it fanned out into a huge windmill, scything through the walls and scattering wood across almost the entire floor of the arena. The entire structure collapsed downward, one floor at a time, with Gaara slowly floating down on a small cloud of sand amidst the sounds of destruction. When he got to the last floor, he let his sand enter, but he waited for the three to exit the building before he finished its destruction. Mother didn't want shredded husks. She wanted a fight. She wanted blood and life to be infused into her own body. They will not die to some random hunk of wood, and deny Mother the pleasure of killing them herself. Gaara landed softly on the ground and didn't so much as blink when the girl in pink darted in on all fours to try and get a hit in, something his sand deflected without instruction or effort. She dodged around the sand, trying to find a gap, but the sand kept up, and her frustrated grunts with each blocked strike filled him with pleasure. The pink girl made an extra hard strike, and in the moment when his sand was focused on the force of her blow, the purple girl darted in on the other side. She was fast, but his sand was faster. Her strikes were very light, and she hit several times for each strike the pink one landed. Each blow caused a tiny portion of the sand to fall in a clump on the ground as the chakra was pushed out of it. Gaara just smirked and called the sand back into the shield, reinforcing the very holes she was trying to knock out. Then his smile fell into a grimace when, through a gap in the sand, he saw Sasuke doing nothing. And that smirk on the boy's face was so smug. No matter, he thought, as his sand swirled around him, blocking every attack. That'll just please mother that much more when he falls. It took all of Sasuke's willpower to stand still and watch his teammate and the Hyuga girl attacking the sand that was swirling around Gaara. He remained in place, carefully molding his chakra one tiny bit at a time and letting it fly away with one of his Kakeichu. Stick with the plan, he kept thinking with each little package released. Stick with the plan. He watched Hinata and Sakura carefully as they struck fruitlessly at the impenetrable barrier before them, and with his perfect clarity, he saw when each one hit just a little lighter and a little longer than usual, especially Hinata, who was far better at disguising her touches as attacks. Then they both disengaged, jumping away, and Sakura smiled as she raised her hand in the snake seal, detonating the tags she had been planting on the ground around the redhead. Then the center of the arena exploded, a great ball of fire that blasted the smashed remains of the building across the arena and made the earth vibrate under their feet. The smoke cleared quickly to reveal Gaara standing calmly, the sand forming a shell around him, which slowly broke off into separate clumps that piled around his body. Pathetic, he said quietly, his voice laden with scorn. Simply pathetic. To know you have watched Mother's defense several times, and then think that something as simple as more force would work? You're barely worth the effort, but Mother still hungers. He raised his hand, and his sand raised with it. Do it, you bastard, do it. Goodbye, said Gaara, spreading out his hand with a look of bored indifference. His sand lashed out in a series of bands, whipping through the air, each one at a different angle and a different speed. Hinata and Sakura dodged back, carefully avoiding the tendrils. They continued to fall back, the sand chasing them as they separated, retreating fully for the walls of the arena. Only a tiny fraction of his sand remained to guard him. Now! Sasuke pushed his chakra down into the nest, weaving it around the queen and touching her in a specific pattern. In response, she released her pheromones, sending out the general order to all outside of the nest to rise and line up as instructed. The line of insects that Sasuke had carefully released and directed into place began to hum, and rose out of the dirt to hover between him and Gaara. Sasuke began his hand seals, pulling the mass of chakra he had gathered and focusing it on his right hand. The Chidori burst into life, the electrical tendrils reaching out, seeing a way to ground itself, only his own chakra and technique keeping it at hand. And when those tendrils found the first insect in the line, filled with his own chakra, it took only the smallest push to transfer the attack to it. Electricity was dangerous to a shinobi for one reason: speed. Unlike every other element, no natural force slowed down lightning. Earth had to defeat its own lack of momentum, water had problems with turbulence, even fire and air had to work against air pressure. Electricity was almost instant, with but a single significant flaw, a natural inclination to ground itself as effectively as possible. But the Chidori was not natural. It was a chakra construct, inner power given form. And while the electricity was drawn to the earth, the chakra was easily drawn to itself. The power of the Chidori touched the first insect and jumped. That insect burst into flames, practically exploding with the power coursing through it. But by then, the power had moved on to the next insect, aimed by the previous one in its last moments of life and drawn by the chakra within the next in line. One by one, in but a blink of an eye, the Chidori followed the line of insects. To the observers, even the shinobi, there was a single moment of brilliant light suddenly arcing at Gaara. Even for the most trained jonin in the stands, even to the Kage themselves, the light could barely be tracked. Only one thing in the arena was faster: the sand at Gaara's feet. It rose before him in a floating shield, blocking the light completely. Then the light passed through the shield, arcing into the redhead himself. Gaara screamed as the electricity coursed through him, not a lance of piercing power, but raw energy grounding itself naturally after coming to the end of its journey. His sand shield slumped to the ground, as did he. Hinata had planted 130 insects in Gaara's sand. Out of those, 12 had died on impact, accidentally squished between her fingertips and the sand. 64 had died when the clumps of sand they were riding dropped to the ground. A further 39 died under the grinding pressure of the sand as it whirled in Gaara's defense. Of the remaining 15, only 3 were within the sand that Gaara had held back for his defense. And out of those 3, only one was mostly intact and capable of directing the electricity into the final target, mere inches away. It shot the chakra-laced electricity at the boy and died. Bereft of the chakra of its creator, the jutsu faded, so the electricity did as nature intended and grounded itself to the water-filled object standing just out of contact. Sasuke was on the move the moment he released the first shock. He charged a second Chidori on the run, racing the sand that had been chasing the 2 girls, trying to reach the boy kneeling in the dirt before his defenses returned. Up in the stands, Kakashi stood, his eye wide, shouting, "Stop, you fool!" Next to him, Myoki looked away, unwilling to watch, while the other Jonin winced and gasped. And below them, at the edge of the stands, standing where he had exited the tunnel to the emergency care ward, Naruto screamed. Because he, too, saw what the others had seen. Gaara was kneeling, hunched over in the dirt, smiling. "I'll make it," thought Sasuke, rushing at his best speed at his target. "I'll make it," he thought, watching with his perfect eyes as the sand moved in slow motion, far too distant to return in time to stop the final strike. "I'll make it." And suddenly he was there, his arm lashing out, the legendary Chidori screaming as it sought the flesh of the monstrous genin. There was a thump, and the chirping sound of the technique faded into silence, a silence matched by those in the stands. Sasuke looked Gaara in the eyes, glaring at the boy, his hand trapped in the grasp of the small pillar of sand between him and his foe, held high above the kneeling Gaara. "You made it," Gaara said through clenched teeth. He raised his hands to the sides, pulling at the sand that was approaching him with his chakra, urging it to come that much faster, both masses taking on a flat edge to squish the Uchiha between them. And now, mother feeds. Naruto had been fighting a mounting sense of horror as he watched his friends fight in the arena. It was not his fight, he was forbidden from fighting, but even so, it took all of his will to stay and watch his friends battle the monster from Suna. Then he saw Gaara smiling as he kneeled in the dirt, and his horror bloomed into full dread. "If I interfere, I'm risking the livelihood of my village." Naruto had been thinking about what the Hokage had said during the preliminaries, and he understood now why these matches were important. They were a show of force, a demonstration, an advertisement of the only goods a shinobi village sold. The moment he got involved, he sent a clear message to everyone watching, that he could not be controlled by the orders of others. He might very well be killing his own career, snuffing out his dream before it even started. Then he saw Gaara's sand rise and trap Sasuke's arm, and the complex problem he had faced smoothed into a simple question, a personal one uninvolved with elaborate words and justifications. Is Sasuke worth less than money? Expressed that way, the answer was clear. He barely noticed lunging over the railing, holding on with one arm to get his feet on the side of the arena wall. "No!" he shouted, pushing off of the wall as hard as he could. He barreled into Sasuke, and he clearly heard the wet snap as his friend's wrist and hand shattered when it was ripped out of the iron grip of the sand. He kicked out as he landed, hitting his friend as hard as he could and launching the boy across the arena. He tucked into a roll and came to his feet, only to fall again, grinding his face into the dirt. He looked back to see the sand that had been holding Sasuke was now wrapped around his own leg. "I'm going to kill you," said Gaara as he walked forward slowly, the 2 masses of sand coming together into one solid mass and hovering over his head, blocking out the sun while Naruto struggled against the sand that held him. "I'm going to grind you into paste, right here, in front of everyone you hold dear. And then..." He leaned forward, a cheerful smile on his face, as if imparting a silly little secret to a dear friend. "And then, I'll do the same to them. I'll start with the purple girl, and I'll bathe in her hopeless screams and tears as she dies. Then, I'll kill the pink girl. I think I'll crush her over the boy, and let her blood stain him body and soul. Then, and only then, will your last friend die, broken and hopeless and alone." He laughed and raised his hand, making a fist, the sand above him compacting tightly as he did so. "That's what you get for having friends," Gaara said. He brought his hand down, and the world faded to black as the giant club came down. "Ah," said a voice in the darkness. "You have finally come to me." Naruto snapped awake, his eyes immediately darting around. He stood, lashing out furiously at the water around him, and found himself somewhere disturbing. It looked like nothing more than a large sewer. The walls were dingy and layered in filth, in some places completely hiding the cracked bricks that made the tunnel. The water at his feet was no more than a thin layer, but it glistened with an oily sheen and clung to his legs like a gel. A pale green light, sourceless and dim, suffused the area, casting dim shadows that had no real source. None of this could explain why Naruto felt so discomfort. No words could describe how wrong it felt. The sewer looked normal to him, if somewhat large, but at the same time it seemed to be twisted and ruined, warped in some barely perceivable fashion, as if the place had been destroyed and rebuilt so close to the original that it was only off-putting to someone who called the place home. But what really drew his attention was the gate. The gate was huge, easily 50 feet tall, wrought out of iron that was rusted and pitted with age. It stood ajar, slightly opened, and Naruto could see some tattered shreds of paper clinging to it. Beyond the gate, there was only darkness, thick, impossible to see through, and yet he knew it contained something. Then the deep voice that had awoken him laughed, the sound echoing out from the darkness. Its tone turned mocking and sweet, and it started to speak as if reciting something. "Will you walk into my parlor?" said the spider to the fly. "'Tis the prettiest little parlor that you ever did spy." Naruto took a step back from the gate, and the voice spoke again. "Fear not, little creature," came the voice, the mocking tone replaced with weary understanding. "I am still bound to you, as I ever was before. You need not fear violence by my hand." Naruto frowned. "I don't need to fear violence from you, but that doesn't mean I should not fear you, does it?" The voice in the dark chuckled softly. "I see the Gray One has done you some good, little creature. Fair enough. I will cause you no harm of any sort. This time." There was a rough sound, as if a great object was dragged across the ground, and a distant clink of chains within the dark. "If you do not come to me," it said after a moment of waiting, "then you shall die. You will return to the outside world, just in time for the red-haired beast to grind you out of existence. Truly, you have little choice but to join me for a conversation." Naruto turned his back and looked away from the gate, and saw only the sewer, stretching away until the weak light gave out to darkness. He looked into the distance for several seconds before he turned to the gate and stepped through. The moment he entered the darkness it vanished, washed away by a diffused white light that filled the world as far as he could see. And before him, he beheld a god. He saw a great fox, as red as the sunset and as large as a house, sitting in the air above him, its legs crossed and its arms resting on them. Below it, a single tail ran down to the floor, holding it aloft, while above, 8 additional tails rose above its head, spaced equally around it, still as a frozen pond. Each tail was wrapped in chains, which ran along and around each one to meet on the being's chest. Upon each tail was a single slip of paper. Upon each paper was a single mark, a number 1 through 9. And upon its chest there was one further mark, which only said destruction. The great fox's eyes were closed, its breath gentle and even, and Naruto suffered a moment of dissonance as he struggled to understand what he was seeing. "You are the Kyuubi?" he asked, his voice clearly conveying his disbelief, "the 9-tailed beast who tried to destroy my home?" "Yes," the great being said, its slightest breath carrying a wave of chakra so intense it stole Naruto's breath. "You gaze upon the form of what you call Kyuubi, the destroyer." A single red eye opened and focused on the small human before it. "I believe tradition indicates you should be trembling with fear, little creature. Wisdom would also suggest the same course of action, so that you might appease my anger. Not that it ever works." Naruto resisted the urge to do just that, forcing himself to stand up straight. "Maybe, but I am going to die anyhow, according to you. You, Gaara, a random kunai. What does it matter how it happens?" "Easy words," said the great beast. "But the merciful death the red-headed monster out there offers you is a far better choice than what I can do to you." A second great eye opened, and the Kyuubi lowered itself slowly to the ground, uncurling its great legs as it did so. It moved with smooth and deadly purpose, ponderous and slow and yet all the more frightful because of how much control the creature had over itself. Once on the floor, the 9th tail rose to take its place amongst its brethren to frame the great creature's body. It leaned forward, towering over Naruto, its jaw slightly agape, its eyes glowing with power and fury. And then Naruto realized that his idea of scale was off, that the creature's head which he had expected to be the size of his body was much larger, that its teeth were almost his size. Its claws were the size of a house. A single one of its tails was as long as an entire block in his village. Naruto had faced the chance of death in combat, but that fear paled in comparison to seeing the infamous monster of legend, the one thing that all Konohagakure shinobi hated and feared beyond all others, moving slowly closer, so big that it could crush him by accident. Naruto performed the bravest action in his young life, one that few other shinobi could do. He crossed his arms and glared at the beast. The creature's head came within inches of his face, but he refused to flinch, and after a moment, the beast chuckled. It moved its head to one side, resting it on the ground and staring at the boy with a single great eye. I credit you, little creature. Few are those who will face me and not tremble. I know you fear me, I can smell it coming from you, and yet you refuse to show it. The Kyuubi inhaled deeply, then slowly let the breath out. You smell of my former keeper, Kushina, the little red-headed maniac. Are you one of her brood, I wonder? Naruto smiled sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head. The one and only. The creature chuckled again. Yes, obviously so. Well, we shall have to have a talk in the future on that, but for now, there are more pressing matters. You are about to die, out in the physical world. But I can offer you the power to survive. Naruto perked up a little, then he frowned. Why are you being so friendly? Accommodating? Helpful? The Kyuubi grinned as only a fox can. Time here is flexible, and we have a moment. Let me tell you a story, in the hopes that it will help you understand the nature of our relationship. One of its great tails curled around Naruto, tucking up behind him until he was sitting on it. Naruto shifted a moment, trying and failing to find a comfortable way to sit. The fox's hair was coarse and stiff, and the lack of any sort of back support didn't help, so in the end, Naruto perched carefully on the tail and ignored the discomfort. The Kyuubi shifted, until it could see Naruto with both eyes, and its voice took on the same tone of recitation it had used earlier. A man who was traveling came to a raging river. The man could not swim, and he was sad to realize his journey was at an end. Then he saw on the very edge of the river a water snake warming itself in the sun. He approached cautiously and hailed the snake, and it replied in kind. They spoke for some time, and the man found that the snake was both charming and friendly. Finally, he asked the snake if it would help him cross the river, so he might carry on. Naruto gave the fox a smile, and the fox returned it, but its smile had far too many teeth to be comforting. The snake agreed readily, and together, they moved into the water, the man holding tight to the snake's body. But halfway across the river, the snake turned suddenly and bit the man. In pain, dying from the venom, the man looked upon the snake and saw that it too was in tears. Why, he asked, why do you cry? If you care so much as to cry, why did you bite me? The snake looked at his dying friend and said, Forgive me, my friend, but I am a water snake. To bite is my nature, and try as I might, one can never change their nature. He dutifully carried the man to the other side. He held watch over his friend as he died, and mourned him, as was appropriate. And then he ate the man, because that too was in his nature. The Kyuubi sat up, slow and ponderous, the smile leaving its face, and it raised its front paw to tap the seal upon its chest. This is no mere seal. It is a title, an appellation, the entirety of my existence writ in but a single word. I am not Kyuubi the Destroyer. I am destruction itself. Naruto frowned up at the titanic fox. Why help me, then? Why not lead me to my doom, if that is all you are? If you're nothing but destruction, why do anything but destroy me? The Kyuubi grinned down on the boy. Yes, I am destruction, a force of nature made into a being of chakra. But not all destruction is evil. You know me for the threat to your village, and to you, that would be bad. When a volcano erupts, the trees and creatures below tremble and die in the flames. They are right to fear. But eventually, the volcano subsides, and new life rises from the ashes. What of that life? Is it somehow less worthy? More? To you, little creature, the doom of your home is horrifying, but to the world, it is but one step in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. Remember, little creature, there is no creation without the destruction of what came before. A painting is naught but the destruction of the pristine white canvas and the loss of much paint from the tube. With that purpose comes some degree of choice. If you are no more worthy of life, you are also no less worthy. I have watched your life to some degree from my cage, and I have found pleasure in your struggles. I cannot keep you alive forever, but here and now, I wish to aid you, so I might continue to observe. So strip the seal from the least of my tails, and live another day with my aid. And you will need it, for the red-haired monster holds one of my kin, and it will take much power and effort to destroy him. He has a beast in him too? Naruto asked. The fox nodded gravely. My fellow beast, the Shikaku, is within. I can sense his taint upon the boy. As I am destruction, Shikaku is manipulation, and he bends that creature's mind to his own sick desires. He is the weakest of my brethren, but the weakest child is a god to the insects below. Take my power, save your friends, and live another day. The beast leaned forward again, and its teeth gleamed. Just remember, there are 2 lessons to be learned from my story. The first is, never forget my purpose. I am an ally, but that does not make me any less dangerous, and my power will ever be of a destructive nature. Expect no more, and no less. It proffered a tale, the first tale, and Naruto looked at it with trepidation. The story was not lost to him. The fox was basically admitting it would kill him one day. Something as small as his death was not enough to justify risking even the smallest of freedoms for his captive guest. But one thought overrode all of his worry, all of his concern. If I refuse, they die. Sasuke, Sakura, Hinata. They would never defeat a thing like Gaara, not as they were now. If he passed on this offer, if he exchanged his life to keep the Kyuubi fully sealed, they would die. He didn't know if what he was feeling was weakness in the face of a tough choice, or the strength to make that choice. He didn't care. He reached out and ripped the tag off, watching as the chains wrapped around that tail shattered and vanished. He felt the burning chakra of the Kyuubi enter his body, its searing power filling him. He stood, suddenly nearly bursting with energy, and started moving towards the exit at a run, desperate to save his friends. Then he froze just before the entrance and turned to face the Kyuubi once more, a frown on his face. I get the first lesson, but what's the second? The Kyuubi reached out and gave Naruto a push with a single claw, knocking the boy into the darkness beyond the gate, and as he was claimed by the darkness, he heard the Kyuubi laugh again. The second lesson is to beware of snakes. Naruto snapped to awareness, the red chakra coursing through his body. He saw the sand coming at him, as solid as a rock and moving so slow it seemed laughable, so he lifted his legs, pressed his feet against the sand, and pushed. He skidded out from under the sand, just avoiding the blow meant to crush him. He reached out and slapped the ground, changing his body's trajectory to send him upwards. This allowed him to land against the wall of the arena, the chakra around his fingers digging into the concrete wall to hold him in place. Naruto grit his teeth as his nerves screamed at him, telling him he was on fire, and found that his teeth fit together poorly now. He shifted his jaw into a more comfortable position, then looked up from where he was and glared at Gaara, who was standing on top of his sandy club with a look on angry confusion, like a petulant child who had a toy taken from them. His eyes shifted slightly, and Naruto suspected that the boy was talking to his own beast. Naruto looked over at where his friends were. Sasuke was on the ground, held up by Sakura and cradling his arm, his face gone pale, his eyes wide as he looked at Naruto. Sakura was also staring at him, her face open and fearful, a single kunai pulled and ready and pointed at him as well. Hinata looked like she had been crying, and she looked fit to start again at his glance. He could see Kakashi, starting to make his way forward from the stands, Kurenai not far behind. He saw Hayate rushing to place himself between Gaara and the other genin. Naruto fought his new and awkward jaw, he fought the burning chakra, he fought the voice of destruction whispering in his ears. He fought all of these things for the ability to give the monster across from him a chance. "Let my friends go," he said, his words harsh even in his own ears. "There is nothing to gain by killing them. Let them go." Gaara seemed to pause for a moment, indecisive. A small frown flashed on his face, but his eyes shifted again, and the frown vanished immediately under a cruel grin. "You say I gain nothing for killing them, but I do. I certainly do. I gain the strength of your pain. It's up to you to get that strength back from me or die trying." He raised his hands and the sand lashed out, barreling at Naruto's friends. The sand never reached them. Even as Sakura tried to gather Sasuke and jump, even as Hinata flinched and raised her arms instinctively, there was a flash of red and an awful keening noise. The sand scattered, blasted aside as Naruto swung his arms at it. The screaming whistle intensified, and Sakura realized that Naruto was holding his swords, the edges shimmering as the wind chakra that imbued the blades ran against itself, creating the sharpest edge known in the shinobi world. Naruto turned slightly, looking at his friends with one frightful, inhuman eye. "Sakura-chan," he said quietly, his words coming out as a growl. "You asked if it was safe, long ago in the land of waves. It was. Now, it is not. Not for him, and maybe not for you. Do you understand?" Naruto felt a chill in his heart when Hinata and Sasuke flinched at his voice, But Sakura, bless her, she nodded in understanding, her eyes going from fearful to calm, and Naruto was certain she would get them out of arena. Gaara's sand returned, a single long tendril trying to sweep the four of them away. Naruto stepped forward and brought one of his blades down in a graceless, inelegant chop that severed the appendage before it could reach them, and the sand fell to the ground and scattered. He turned his head again and saw his friends still waiting there, as if they were expecting something. "Flee!" He shouted at them, his voice coming out as a monstrous roar, and finally they escaped, using him for protection as they vaulted out of the arena. He looked away, casting his gaze back to Gaara, who was looking up at the Kage's box with a big smile on his face. That smile that was the last straw. Naruto felt the red fury boiling in his heart, and he stopped resisting. Orochimaru leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers in front of his face and staring into the arena with a vague smile. A thin chuckle passed his lips, carried on the lightest of breaths and just loud enough to reach the ear of the Kazekage. "Damn him!" shouted Raza, reaching into his robes and pulling out a scroll. "I'll not let him sully our village this way." He opened the scroll to reveal a storage seal and reached out to it, summoning the contents, one large box that hit the floor with a solid thud. Raza raised his arms out, aiming at his son, then turned and looked at the unmoving box. Confused, he lashed out with a foot, breaking open the box to reveal not the gold dust he was famous for, but thousands of tiny lead pellets. His eyes widened in shock, and he turned to look at his son in the arena, who gave him a cold grin and nodded once. "You shrewd little shit," thought Raza, his mind racing. Any words they might have shared were lost forever when the boy with the red chakra attacked. Gaara's head snapped around when his shield of sand suddenly shook violently. It kept shaking, and the sound of thunderous blows was soon joined by a scream. Gaara knew screams. He knew the scream of anger when someone watched their teammates die. He knew the scream of pain, when he took his time and crushed one limb at a time. He knew the scream of horror when they inevitably realized that there was no escape and they were going to die a terrible death. But this was a scream of rage, a verbal promise to inflict pain and suffering upon him, as merciless as Gaara himself, and he found himself surprised and a little disturbed. With each blow against the wall of sand, the scream grew in intensity, the promise more certain. Gaara had never heard such a sound, and for the first time since his uncle Yashimaru had tried to murder him, he felt a touch of fear. He reached out for his mother, begging for her aid. She laughed at his need. She always laughed at his need. "Earn it," she whispered in his ear, as sweet and mocking as ever. "Earn my love and support, little Gaara of the sand." He tried to reply, but suddenly found himself at a loss for words when the shield parted, revealing the blonde genin, cutting furiously at his shield with a pair of swords and making genuine headway against it. The blonde saw Gaara, and he screamed again, revealing teeth grown sharp, then started redoubling his efforts, carving great rends with each cut. Gaara abandoned his defense, lashing out with as many strands as he could control, and it was enough to knock the blonde away for a moment. Gaara flicked his fingers, shooting dozens of large, sharp flows of sand at the stand behind the blonde in the hopes of distracting him, but his foe ignored the shards and changed again, lashing out at any sand that reached for him, closing the distance at an alarming rate. Gaara lowered his arms, flattening the sand before the charging boy in an instant, then raised them again. The sand raised itself quickly, wrapping around the blonde's arms. The boy screamed again and started to thrash, twisting his arms and body, swinging the blades about in an attempt to sever the sand holding him without losing a limb. Gaara smirked and raised his arms further. "Let's see him fight after I crush his limbs." Then the world exploded around him. Chapter 40, The Beast. Kakashi was cursing as he and his fellow Jonin began to work their way towards the arena. They ran through the crowd, and sometimes on them, but just short of jumping the group, there was no way to advance quickly enough for his tastes. And nobody was going to take a long jump into an arena containing the kid with the sand. All around him, across the entire arena, more and more Konohagakure shinobi were starting to move, swarming through the crowd. The sudden increase in movement, and the realization that it was shinobi on the move, caused more than a little panic. To a civilian, after all, a shinobi was nothing more than a blur. Then Naruto screamed, and to the person, the shinobi stopped. Kakashi could not understand at first why they all stopped, almost by instinct. It wasn't the angry tones of the scream, or its surprisingly high pitch, or the vision of Naruto viciously hacking at the sand shield like a butcher. There was nothing special in those things. And yet, somehow, that scream pressed the same button in the hearts and minds of the shinobi in the stands, the big red button that had the word Kyubi written below it in the blood of their friends and family. That button was always a tool of fear for the people of Konohagakure. And fear is a mind killer. I have failed, he thought, his face going white under his mask, utterly and completely. Minato's sun has fallen, and I did nothing to stop it. Kakashi fought against the overwhelming sensation of horror as he watched Naruto, his face bestial, smashing at the sand. The boy was not fighting as a shinobi. There was no planning, no grace, no tactics. He was fighting as an animal, a monster, paying no mind to anything beyond his foe. Then he spotted the darts of sand flying out of the arena, and the horror faded into the background as he realized that he now had a single task to perform, before all others. He ignored the sand spikes that Gaara was throwing at the crowds of civilians, trusting the other Jonin to protect the civilians under attack. They all knew where he was going and what he was doing, because they had all been raised in the same village with the same will of fire. They all would have done the same. Kakashi ran to his students, those that he could save, anyhow. With a burst of chakra, he landed beside Sakura, down in the field. The girl flinched as he arrived, so focused on the danger of the two battling genin that she had not seen her sensei moving towards her. Sasuke, meanwhile, had been watching carefully, his one arm held tight to his chest. "Exam's over," said Kakashi, bluntly. "Out." Sasuke nodded, but Sakura shook her head and pointed behind Sasuke, where Hinata was standing. "She won't leave, and when we try to move her, she freaks out." Gave Sasuke a mean tap on the same arm that broke. Hinata's eyes were wide, tears streaming down her face unheeded as she watched Naruto scream and thrash at the constantly regenerating sand, and Kakashi had the sinking sensation that the little Hyuga understood exactly what he did. Naruto is lost. Save who you can. Kakashi didn't hesitate. Even if Hinata had been prepared to fight back, she could not match his speed, and a single blow was enough to knock her nearly senseless. Kakashi slung the girl over his shoulder and felt a small spark of appreciation when he noticed that the moment he'd done so, his students had evacuated. He preparing to jump when Hinata started to scream. He swung instinctively to face the battle, in time to see Naruto charge straight at his target only to become ensnared by several tendrils of sand. "Do something!" The girl was screaming. Kakashi did the only thing he could think of. He threw a kunai with an explosive tag at the base of the sand holding Naruto, a hopeless gesture. He had seen enough to know that a single tag would not damage the sand enough to free his genin. But he could not bear the thought of turning away without trying to help, even if the gesture was empty and hopeless. "Bombs!" He heard Guy shout from the stands, and while not every shinobi up there understood, enough did. 3 more tagged kunai hit the sand, the paper burning as they counted down to detonation. A dozen more landed from various directions around Gaara. Kakashi waited a moment, timing it carefully, and detonated his tag with the others. A great fireball filled the arena with smoke and thunder, and Kakashi waited just long enough to see Naruto fly out of the smoke and tumble to the dirt before he jumped away, the still shouting girl on his back as explosive kunai rained from the sky. Hiruzen had no doubt about his own priorities. As much as he wanted to enter the arena, he knew that others would look to him for guidance, so he guided them. "Shield the civilians!" he bellowed, jumping away from the Kage box towards the nearest section of stands. He landed with his staff, the weapon form of the boss of his monkey summons clutched firmly in his hands. When Gaara started to lash out with his sand, Hiruzen started batting away at the incoming attacks. He was somewhat surprised when Orochimaru landed beside him, his blade drawn. He was even more surprised that the Sannin didn't attack him, but instead kept his focus towards the arena, covering another section of the fleeing crowds. "You never struck me as the kind to defend civilians," Hiruzen said, extending the staff to ludicrous lengths to swat an entire line of sand darts apart. "And you never struck me as the sort to look a gift horse in the mouth," the Sannin replied, his own blade extending out with each strike. He turned to his former sensei and gave the old man a tight-lipped smile. "I am glad to see you've become more sensible in your dotage." Hiruzen grunted, but he could not stop the small grin that appeared on his face. That grin faltered almost immediately when he saw Naruto's sudden capture by Gaara's sand. His chest ached deeply as he watched the boy struggle against his bonds. He could not abandon his position and leave his people defenseless. Not even for Naruto. Then he heard one of his jonin shout for explosives. Dozens of tags flew into the arena from all sides, and Hiruzen dropped Enma just long enough to send a few of his own. Even if the damage never reached Gaara, It might distract him enough. The tags in the arena exploded just as Kakashi jumped out of it, the Hyuga era slung over his shoulder. The fireball covered much of the fighting pit in black smoke. Moments passed, and the sound of panicking civilians finally faded as the last of them made their way out to the relative safety beyond the surrounding walls. A few shinobi, no longer required to block sand darts, continued to throw explosives into the smoke. Kakashi soon joined Hiruzen, accompanied by Sasuke and Sakura, with Hinata still being carried like a sack of grain. He looked down into the smoke, his one eye narrowed, and after a moment, he shifted the girl over his shoulders and hiked up his forehead protector to start looking through his Sharingan eye. There was a sudden shout from the Kage's box, and Raza jumped down to land next to Hiruzen. His face was white, his eyes wide. "Sarutobi, we have a problem," Naruto roared from within the smoke. Something else roared back. Jiraiya looked back at the arena at the sound of the colossal roar, his legs and arms flexing slightly in response. He knew his duty. He and Hiruzen had long since discussed it. When danger happens, you save the civilians first, then rejoin the battle. It was a terrible thing to know that his teacher, his mentor, and a very old shinobi at that, was battling against a bijou without him. But to turn away from the civilians before they were far enough away to be safe would be to go against everything Hiruzen had taught him. Jiraiya returned to his task, gritting his teeth and ignoring the sounds of battle. Naruto had barely paused his assault. The moment he stopped tumbling, he pulled himself onto his hands and feet, crouching in a way that felt both unnatural and right at the same time, his blade still held in his fists, the skin on his knuckles shredding as he slid along the ground. He will not hide from me. Naruto tried to focus his mind, but he was being besieged within his own head. Every sense was vibrant, painfully so. The glare of the sunlight on the walls of the arena seared his eyes, every step in the dirt produced a jarring noise, and the smells were almost indescribable. There was no words in his mind for the smell of grass growing, or the scent of sunlight warming the earth, but he sensed them, a wall of smell that was alien to him. But worst of all was the voice. It was not the sound of the Kyuubi's voice. It was not a real voice at all. But some part of his mind, deep behind his eyes, would not stop making demands of him, demands he wanted no part of. "Slay the sand child," it whispered. "No," he thought, pressing back against the sudden urge to kill. "Slay the sand child. Slay the black-haired child. Slay them both. Claim the pink-haired child as yours." "No, damn it." Naruto feared for his sanity, trying to resist. The wants, the desires his inner voice were calling for, felt right. Natural. Good. Moment by moment, they pushed against his mind, and moment by moment, he pushed back by reminding himself of who he was. The black-haired child is my best friend. The pink-haired child is not something to claim. The sand child, it was there that Naruto had the most trouble. He had nothing to resist with. The sand Gaara. Gaara is a foe, and a dangerous one. There's no reason to spare the sand child my wrath. Naruto's eyes narrowed. That last thought felt wrong. Then something caught his attention. He had no idea what it was, the sensation of moving air currents maybe, or the change of the texture of the smoke in the air. Whatever it was, he jumped straight up, narrowly avoiding the broad sweep of sand that swept out of the smoke and struck where he had been standing a moment before. No more time for thinking. Only attack. He charged into the smoke, trusting senses he barely understood. He dodged to the left, narrowly missing a second tendril of sand. That transitioned into a tumble, and he felt the sand pass over his back. He jumped a third attack, and came across a large orb of sand, covered in spikes and tendrils. Gaara must be trying to hide within. His sand meant nothing to Naruto. He dropped on of his swords, charging at the orb with a single sword held in both hands. He roared in fury and lunged, his chakra blade biting deep into the orb of sand. The reaction was immediate. There was a high-pitched keening noise, and the orb exploded outwards, smashing into Naruto hard enough to send him flying out of the remaining smoke and into the wall of the arena. He hit with jarring force, feeling several bones crack on impact, and he dropped to the ground, clutching his head, as the scream continued, slowly lowering in pitch as it rose into the air. Pain was the center of Gaara's world. He clutched at his arm, uncontrolled tears flowing down his face and mixing with the blood that has splashed him. His blood. Pain was something new to the genin. By instinct, he did what any boy would do. He turned to his mother and cried for her aid. He did what she wanted of him. He always did. He held off from attacking his father all this time, held off from actually killing anyone until now, just as she demanded. He gave them scary glares and monstrous smiles. And like always, despite his effort, she had left him alone, abandoned him to face the darkness without her help and love. Without her, he was alone. The only time she came to him was when he allowed her to feed. When he was so alone he would do anything to have someone. Please, he whispered. I'm scared. Help me. Of course, Mother said, her power flowing into him. Would I really abandon you? Gaara flinched at her tone, and bit down the answer that came to him. Of course not, Mother. Good boy. Shut your eyes and let me in. Every shinobi in the arena looked up at the growing form of the Shikaku, the one-tailed beast, as it raised from the arena floor and roared into the sky. Except for Orochimaru. He was far too busy sending signals to his servants. They appeared from behind pillars, 5 of them. Each wore a simple gray tabard over black body suits, each with a purple rope tied around the waist as a simple and cheap belt. They already knew their duty. All 5 dashed into the arena, and while 4 of them spread out to surround the towering beast of sand, the 5th darted straight at Naruto where he crouched, still dazed. Naruto growled in the back of his throat as his bones knit together, and with a final sickening pop, he felt the last bone in his spinal column repair itself, finally granting him proper use of his legs again. He crouched down, eyeing the massive beast before him and questioning what he could do about it, but from the corner of his eye he saw a gray figure darting at him, closing with incredible speed. Another foe to crush. Naruto raised his arms and lunged at the moving figure, lashing out with his sword in a single quick stroke. His foe was inconveniently fast, however, and dodged around the blade with incredible grace before throwing itself at him with its arms wide. Naruto stepped back, thumping into the arena wall, dropping his sword and raising his arms to try and grapple with the gray-clad shinobi. Then the boy wrapped his arms around Naruto and gave him a hug. It's good to see you, Naruto. The blonde genin pressed down hard against the swirling confusion in his head and looked at the face of the person clinging to him. It took a moment to recognize the face, dressed so differently and with a Otogekure forehead protector sitting around the boy's neck, but eventually the memory of the last time he had seen the boy resurfaced, and he managed to mumble through his distorted jaw. Haku? Haku nodded and smiled, but the smile dropped instantly when the painfully bright sunlight started to fade into cool shadow. Haku grabbed Naruto and jumped, pushing against the arena wall, and they both barely escaped from the giant fist that struck the ground where they had stood. They rolled to their feet and looked up, to the top of the towering beast that was looking at them with coldly amused eyes. Run, little creatures, it said, its deep voice mockingly sweet. Run and dodge and flee from me. I am free once more, and there is so much to do to you. There is no pleasure greater than slaughtering you little creatures and then leaving little Gaara to stand alone amidst the carnage. Such tears he once had. Such screams. And every time, it gets harder and harder to break him, which means I get to be more and more creative. It raised its arm again, a broad grin forming on its muzzle. Flee, flee. Live for just one moment at a time. Scramble for my pleasure. Naruto bit down the urge to lash out. The thing towered over him, as big as any building in town, and mindlessly beating on it with a sword would be pointless. Instead, he stepped back, only to stop when Haku reached a hand out to stop him. Not too far, he said. The box is going up. Box? The moment the word left his mouth, the 4 shinobi that had taken up station around the arena floor crouched, their last hand seals ending in a palms outward pose. 4 walls of purple energy formed, neatly trapping the great beast within them along with Naruto and Haku. What do we do? Asked Naruto, glancing around the now severely reduced space as the one-tailed beast roared and pounded on the glowing energy barrier. Now we need to survive, said Haku, crouching down and preparing to move. There is already a plan. If nothing else, trust that no snake leaves its den unprepared. I can stop this. But I need your help. Hiruzen turned away from the arena and the purple barrier, keeping him away from the genin within. Keeping him away from Naruto, Minato's son, someone he considered his own. He reached out and grabbed Orochimaru by the shirt, then pulled his former apprentice forward, until he was holding the Sannin off the ground. You can help, he growled, by taking down that shield. Orochimaru sneered at the Hokage, his voice level and as cold as his namesake. That shield is the only reason the creature is not running amok through your village. And this time, there is no spare Namikes around to seal it, nor a convenient vessel to hold it. You might win eventually, but how many hundreds might die in the meantime? Think, damn you. He's right. Hiruzen glared at his student, who retained his sneer as the old man held him above the ground. Sealing a bijou was an art, and one that generally could not be hurried. Killing the Suna Jinchuriki would be difficult, if not impossible, with the forces he had on hand. Calling for more forces would mean local destruction. Not doing so would give the creature free rein until they assembled. And Hiruzen did not have a lot of gold just lying about. Hiruzen glared for a few seconds, then slowly lowered Orochimaru back to the ground. You have a plan. I can tell, because you're breathing. The Sannin brushed off his shirt and grimaced. I can end this here and now, Hokage-sama, and you know how it irks me to call you that, but you and only you can grant me permission to help, because it requires something I learned from my research, and it requires the life of a single person. You want that person to be me, said Hiruzen. It was not a question. Orochimaru shrugged his shoulders. There would be no reason to do that. It could be anyone, really. A child from an orphanage, an old retired shinobi already marching fully towards death, you. Who does not matter. But it must be a human, and you must choose, because no other has that right. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed. Why me? Orochimaru gave the old man a sharp grin. That's the price you have to pay. One life amongst all of yours, any life, but it must be by your choice. One life against the entirety of your village, Hiruzen. Choose wisely, and quickly. Your genin could use the help. Orochimaru turned away, watching the two shinobi within the barrier, facing off against a monster. He had chosen Haku for this task because of his superior speed, and that speed was doing him well. Naruto, meanwhile, was having a harder time of it, and even as he watched, the boy narrowly avoided a sudden backhand from the creature. He carefully avoided watching Hiruzen's face as he tried to find the right thing to do by his quaint moral standards. He'd seen all of that before, and while amusing, it was not worth the risk of Hiruzen making the wrong choice. Who do I order to die? No, to be executed, for the good of the village. Hiruzen found himself in a rare moment of indecision. There was no doubt in his mind that it was an execution. This was not some dangerous mission, where the outcome was uncertain. They would die, without question, and, knowing Orochimaru, right in front of him. His first thought was to offer himself, but he shot that down. He had long accepted he would die in battle, and had lived a long time for a shinobi. But if he died at Orochimaru's hands, it would be bedlam. Even if he publicly declared it, the village would assume manipulation of some sort, and as soon as the giant Tanuki fell, there would be war. Next, he looked at Kakashi. Kakashi would be willing to do what it takes to save his own students. But there, too, the price would be terrible. Hiruzen already worried what might happen to the team, now that his secret would almost certainly be out. Suddenly losing their teacher at the same time could lead to 3 genin who would be almost as dead to the world as their teacher. Kakashi needed to live. Everywhere Hiruzen looked, he only saw bad choices. Everyone had value. Everyone would be missed, both in the heart and in the workforce. Hiruzen's face fell, and he found himself circling the one thought he wanted to ignore the most. I'm not strong enough to do this. Not a single choice available to him was anything short of murder in his eyes, justified or not. They were shinobi, trained to fight and serve and die on his command, but they were also family. Orochimaru's eyes narrowed just slightly. He didn't need to look to see the effect this was having on Hiruzen. Then a stranger landed at his feet and knelt, a short Konoha shinobi who was cadaverous slender. Lord Hokage, Lord Orochimaru. Danzo-sama sends his regards. The man continued to kneel, but he looked up at Hiruzen, his eyes already dead. I was chosen to shadow you today, from the depths of the earth where me and mine carry the burden of the great tree, and was ordered to preserve the Hokage and Konohagakure itself should Orochimaru turn against us. This will fulfill my orders. Root. That single word explained a great deal. Danzo's personal ANBU, loyal beyond fault and trained to be emotionless servants. The Hokage had lost track of how many broken men and women had come away from their time in Root a living wreck. He didn't even know how many never came back at all. He did not approve of Danzo's methods or his obstinate insistence in keeping the organization in place, nor did he particularly trust what was essentially a big personal hit squad for his primary political opponent. That did not make them any less a member of his village. He shook his head. I will not order your death. The man nodded in return. No. I will volunteer. I am already doomed, Lord Hokage. My medical records will attest to that. A few weeks of declining health is an easy sacrifice against a threat to the village, Lord Hokage. Hiruzen turned and looked to the stands, easily seeing the stern figure of Shimura Danzo standing to the rear under the awnings across the barrier. The battle-scarred man noticed the scrutiny and nodded once, as if he already knew the conversation they were having, before turning and slowly walking away, the purple barrier casting him in an inhuman light. It was such an easy choice. It was an easy choice presented by Danzo and Orochimaru. It was also the only choice. Hiruzen stepped forward and laid his hands on the shoulders of the kneeling shinobi. Tell me your name, brave soldier. For the first time, the man hesitated, a moment of confusion passing across his face. I am Aburame Rain, Hokage-sama. He looked up at Hiruzen, and his lips turned slightly upwards, more than Hiruzen would have expected from a member of Root. Thank you, Hokage-sama. The Hokage bowed to the man before him, the name already seared into his mind. He stepped back, sighed, and gave Orochimaru a single nod. The Sannin stepped forward, bringing out a pair of scrolls, and crouched. This will take a few moments, he said, pulling one of the scrolls open to reveal a series of storage seals and running his finger along until he picked one. Why the hell are they keeping us in here? Naruto shouted as he dashed past Haku, closely followed by a trail of projectiles that cracked the earth where they landed. He was growing very irritated. Shikaku would not stop laughing. Naruto was still a genin, but he was not an idiot. Several times, he had made mistakes, dodging in the wrong direction. Each time, Shikaku had missed him. Instead, it would let Naruto escape and continue with its braying laugh and constant mockery. I am keeping you here because you are fun, monkey, came the unexpected reply. The beast rotated within the cramped confines of the purple walls and looked down at Naruto, grinning at the boy with a mouth large enough to swallow him whole. You run and dodge so well, for a little coward. I'm just waiting for you to get tired of scurrying like a scared little bunny and either drop dead from the fear or finally attack me with all of your strength. Dick, Naruto thought, jumping aside as another slow paw of sand smashed into the ground next to him. It didn't help that the power that was keeping him alive, keeping him moving, was trying to tell him the same thing, even though the powerful cloak of chakra had faded over time, leaving him no stronger than normal. Everything within him wanted him to charge at the big monster and tunnel his way right to Gaara and Naruto pushed those thoughts down. It wanted him to attack. Naruto was not an idiot. He had long put away his sword. It could carve chunks off of Shikaku, and that seemed to hurt it, but it never did anything to really harm or stop it. He knew that it would not help him any. So why does it want me to attack? Naruto took a moment to breath as Haku drew the creature's attention with a few senbon. The tiny little needles made Shikaku laugh, every time, and with the last few attacks, the beast had started to deliberately stop and give Haku all the chance in the world to hurt him with the needles. Naruto watched as Haku spun and jumped and threw, all for nothing. He watched as Shikaku laughed and leaned forward, opening its eye wide and inviting a strike. He watched as Haku raised his hand, then stopped and let the opportunity pass with a disgruntled sigh. The boy instead jumped to where Naruto was resting and shook his head. I can't possibly harm it, Naruto. And once it accepts that and stops laughing, he's going to focus you down. Haku's eyes grew misty. There is nothing I can do for you. I'm sorry. Shikaku was waiting, quietly watching with its big, leering, ugly face. Why is it not attacking? Why is it playing with us? What can it possibly get out of prolonging this fight, letting us toss pointless attacks on it? The Kyuubi claimed he was the essence of destruction. He also claimed that this one was manipulation. But surely it would be smarter than this. This was pointless showmanship, threats and mockery as it grossly overpowered them. That was hardly manipulating someone. Naruto looked over at Haku, who was looking up at the creature with disgust. Tired, forlorn, hopeless. He then looked up at Shikaku, grinning and watching Haku closely. It knows we can't win. It wants us to know we can't win. We're being manipulated, all right, but only in one direction, you lying nine-tailed bastard. He shoved Haku as hard as he could, sending the boy stumbling back, then turned to Shikaku. You dick. He shouted up at the creature. You ginormous dick. I get what you're doing, you dick. You don't care about killing us, or anyone, do you? Shikaku leaned forward, its massive bulk filling Naruto's vision. Maybe. So what? All that matters to you is that your time on this earth is measured by how amusing you are to me. Are you so sure you should be standing still right now? It raised a massive paw slowly, moving with a sort of delicate precision. When the paw was raised up, it flexed, and thousands of spikes of sand jutted out of its pad. Naruto slowly raised his hand in turn, moving with the same degree of care, then rotated his wrist 180 degrees and raised exactly one finger. You want me to fear you? Well, fuck you. Hiruzen stepped back further as the ash and dust surrounded the stoic Aburame. He could see the man twitch slightly, but he did not stand, nor did he shout out, and his eyes remained on Hiruzen until the technique covered them. Hiruzen took another step back as the ash took on a familiar shape, then color. What blasphemy have you committed, Orochimaru? He spat. Orochimaru grinned from where he was kneeling. You say blasphemy. I say salvation. The long black hair. The red armor. The forehead protector. Even the eyes looked as warm and inviting as Hiruzen remembered. Then it smiled and stretched with a loud grunt, turning its head from side to side before stopping to look at Orochimaru. Yo, Snake-chan, said Hashirama Senju, first Hokage and creator of the shinobi way of life. What's it this time? House burned down and needs a new roof. Do I get to save poor little orphans? Or, wait, no, I think I got this, we're going to be doing some of those horrific experiments you enjoy way too much, right? He reached up and scratched the back of his head, then froze. Orochimaru nodded, and his mouth quirked up slightly. That's right, no tag, he said, spreading his empty hands palm up. No coercion. No force. I brought you here as a favor, for me and for you. Hashirama's eyebrows shot up, and he looked around again until he saw Hiruzen. Hey, that's the Hokage's robes. He stepped forward and leaned down, peering up at the third's face. Then Hiruzen saw the man's eyes sparkle, and without warning, Hashirama stepped forward and wrapped him in a crushing hug. Ha! He laughed, I know that mighty wrinkled brow. Hello, Hiruzen. I see Scale Face was telling the truth when he said you were running the place. Knew it would happen. He turned from the clearly shocked Hokage and looked at Orochimaru again, placing one hand companionably around his former student's shoulders. Did I ever tell you about the time I beat him with his own monkey, Mr. Slithers? He challenged me to a spar, the cheeky thing, and a rumbling laugh from the arena below cut off his story, and his eyes narrowed. Why am I here, Orochimaru? The one-tailed beast is running loose, Orochimaru replied, standing up and brushing off his robes. We have it contained, but we do not have the power to stop it without letting it loose. As we're on the edge of Konohagakure, and as it seems to have a taste for murder, I figured you'd be willing to lend a hand. Shikaku did not look amused at Naruto's outburst. Excuse me, little fragile monkey, you heard me. Fuck you. You can chase me all over this arena, you can smash and roar and mock, but I'll be damned if I'll give you the satisfaction. A second arm came up, with a second finger firmly raised. Shikaku leaned back, its giant grin becoming a frown. You refuse to fear me. I'm out of the right kind of fingers, so imagine I just raised a third one. The great beast shrugged, then raised one giant foot and slammed it down with all of its might. The earth beneath his foot cracked and buckled, the damage spreading out from where its foot had landed all the way out to the walls. And the big, rotund man in one of the corners of the shield staggered out of place. The walls flickered for only a moment, but that moment was enough for Shikaku to send another wave of darts, these ones smashing into the four corners of the barrier. 3 of the team jumped clear, but the round man only screamed as the sand crushed him. Shikaku took a step forward and leaned down, rummaging through the sand at its feet until it found the crushed and mangled body of the dead sound shinobi. He pulled the body up by a single leg and stepped forward to hold it over Naruto. The boy looked up into the man's dead eyes, drops of blood splattering on his face. All humans claim they are beyond fear, said the beast, shaking the body to allow it to drip more freely. All humans lie about it, to themselves most of all. Everyone fears the loss of something. You are willing to defy me when I threaten your life. That does not make you fearless. It just means there is something you value even more than your own meager life. It leaned down, 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 pressing its giant head to the ground before the red-speckled genin. You are a shinobi, and they come in 3 flavors. One fears death of self. One fears death of their home. And one fears for their friends. Naruto was not an idiot, but he was human, and at the thought of his friends in danger, He flinched, just slightly. Haku's reaction was a lot more visible. He snarled and darted at the creature, screaming in anger. Shikaku barely turned its face to look before reaching out and flicking the boy away with a single finger, sending him sailing up into the stands. Shikaku then rose and nodded slightly, its expression without a trace of the mad glee it had before. I'm not going to kill you, little monkey. Oh, no. I want you to cry. I'm going to go for a walk now, and find your little friends, and bring them back here. And I'll hold them in my hands, oh so gently, and let them cry and whimper and beg you to help them. And you'll try, oh, you will try, and you will fail, and when you finally collapse from exhaustion, I will crush them, one by one, slowly, so you can hear every whimper and scream and crack and splat. And then it released the body in its hands, letting it drop, the force of the fall causing blood and filth to splash on Naruto, who stepped back and stared at the dead man. I'm going to let you live. You'll walk away, live on as long as you will. How long will you keep yourself alive, under that pressure, that agony? How long until you take your own life just to silence the screams? The creature laughed, no loud roar of amusement, but a low, dark chuckle. It reached out and poked Naruto gently with his paw, sending the stunned boy to the ground. Where are those proud words of defiance, little monkey? Fuck me? No, fuck you. Naruto looked up at the giant, unstoppable monster, and unbidden tears started to form in his eyes. The beast nodded, once, and turned away. Then it roared as a giant gate of solid wood crashed onto it from above, slamming it into the ground. It struggled to rise, shifting the gate in its efforts, then fell to the ground with a grunt as another slammed on top of the first, then another, and another, each one bigger than the last, each one slamming the others that much deeper into the ground. With a final pained roar, Shikaku faded, leaving only a sobbing Gaara, who was quickly bound with wooden tendrils that burst from the ground. Naruto could only look on, confused, as the Hokage and the other leaders arrived. Hiruzen knelt and tried to say something, but all Naruto could do was stare at the crying boy in the wood, screaming for his mother to come and defend him, save him, speak to him even, pleading for her to come back. Well, said Orochimaru, standing next to Hiruzen, only one thing left to do. He moved quickly, darting at the woodbound Jinchuriki, blade drawn. Hiruzen turned to pursue, but he was slow, too slow. Raza only watched, his face dour. Orochimaru came to a stop. He did not spare any words for the crying child. He pulled his arm back and thrust it. The blade stopped with a clink, and Orochimaru smiled down at the boy in front of him. Even after all of that? He asked quietly. Naruto glared, the point of Orochimaru's blade resting neatly in the center of the metal plate on his forehead protector. Everyone froze, even Hiruzen, still out of reach. No, said the genin. He's a hurt kid. He's a threat, replied the Sannin, his face blank, emotionless. He's crying now, but he'll be laughing again tomorrow, and he will carry a grudge. No, said the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. He's suffering. He'll try to kill you, and your friends, and your village. Don't let good intentions cost you everything. No, said Naruto. Or else. Orochimaru leaned over, glaring at the little blonde kid defying him, and in a voice so quiet none other could hear him, he whispered, good. The Sannin then leaned back and pulled his sword away, turning to walk away. You only made one mistake here, Naruto-kun. Do you know what it was? Naruto continued to glare. Orochimaru looked over his shoulder and grinned. You turned your back on an enemy. Then the kunai slid into Naruto's back. Chapter 41, Unpleasant Solutions. He asked specifically for you. Kakashi grunted, looking through the one-way mirror at the captive. Orochimaru had not resisted capture, once the ANBU had jumped into the arena and snatched Naruto away. He had simply stopped where he was, put his sword away, and surrendered to the Hokage. He didn't resist the chakra-disrupting shackles being attached to his wrists, nor the ones on his ankles. He didn't protest the hood over the head, the rough handling, or the bare cell he now sat in, chained securely to the only furniture in the room, a large steel chair that had been anchored to the floor. He answered questions with nothing more than the basic facts of the fight, which was more than reasonable for the leader of a North village, and asked no favors, save one. He wanted to talk to Kakashi. Everyone involved found this disturbing, no one more so than the man himself. He turned and gave Marino Ibiki a curious glance. So, why do you want me to meet him? I was under the impression that we don't usually accommodate your guests, Ibiki. The scarred special Jonin sighed and looked back at the Sannin in the other room with a pensive scowl. Normally, no, but in this case, we have more to gain than lose. He walked away from the window, to the desk in the observation room, and started shuffling a few papers around. We can't use any genuine interrogation methods. Torturing a hidden village leader who entered under the truce of the Chunin exams would be a political nightmare, all the more so after they restrained a rampaging Bijou with the loss of only 2 shinobi, one of which was his own. Kakashi grunted at that. The boy, Haku, had survived the casual blow from the Ichibi and the crash landing in the stands, but had suffered some terrible breaks in his right arm and leg, as well as a few other injuries. But one of the sound shinobi who had been maintaining the cage had been crushed into a paste, and someone Kakashi knew nothing about had apparently died to summon. Wait. What about the first? Ibiki sighed and ran a hand over his face. Don't even get me started. I have a particularly useful member of ANBU with him at the moment. Harashima stared at the ANBU. The ANBU stared back. In the process of sorting out the new prisoners, Hiruzen had ordered that Hashirama, the founder of Konohagakure, should be brought to a cell for interrogation. None of the ANBU present had seen the wink Hashirama had tossed to Hiruzen before he schooled his face into a glower. The 3 ANBU had drawn straws to see who would try first. The first ANBU, who went by Boar, had ordered the first Hokage to march, and when the man did not comply, he had attacked. His arm would be fine in a few days. The second ANBU, who went by Eagle, had attempted to bodily carry the first to the cells. They were picking thorns out of his skin down at the hospital. The third ANBU was not their usual partner, and had objected to their plans. After they had been led away, he stood there for some time, watching the unmoving legend of his homeland smile and look around in curiosity, and eventually he decided to do the obvious thing when confronting someone far more powerful than yourself. This ANBU, who happily thought of himself by his code name of Weasel, had politely asked Senju Hashirama to accompany him down to the cells, which the first had cheerfully agreed to do. Weasel was going to give the other 2 so much shit when they got back to active duty. In theory, he was supposed to interrogate Hashirama. Well, the exact order was, find out who this really is and why they are here. Under the circumstances, he decided to keep the common sense rolling and started politely asking questions. Hashirama had politely answered, although he was very vague on how he was created by that fork-tongued miscreant. Weasel suspected that his answers were vague because, to be honest, it's not like he was there to watch the process of his own creation. For some reason, the TNI member watching from the other side of the glass had decided that Hashirama's answers were unacceptable, and tougher measures were needed. They were sure the man would wake up any moment now, at the hospital. So now, they sat alone in the cell, face to face, well, face to mask. Only now was Weasel willing to take a risk. He slowly raised his hand, reached out and moved his dragon horse 1 square forward. Check, Hokage-sama, he said. Hashirama looked down at the board and laughed. I never was any good at this, he admitted cheerfully. Kakashi grunted again and returned to watching Orochimaru. The Sannin was smiling, right at the glass, right at Kakashi. After a moment of thought, Kakashi stepped 1 pace to the left and noticed Orochimaru's eyes track his movement, in spite of the sheer impossibility of his action, between the glass and the shackles. So, why am I going in there? He asked, stepping to the right and watching the captive. Ibiki shrugged. Up until now, he has remained unhelpful. He periodically taps a code out with his manacles, or whistles a tune that is also a code, or hums something that the codebreakers highly suspect, surprise, is a code. Ibiki grinned in a decidedly unfriendly manner. So far, all of these codes have carried messages praising the codebreakers for their diligent waste of time and resources. The only thing he has directly said to us was that he wanted to talk to you before we let him go. I am inclined to go along with it, just to get him to talk. Never know what might be useful. It could be a setup for escape, said Kakashi. Ibiki shrugged. He has enough chakra suppression gear on him, between the manacles and the chair, to keep a Jinchuriki down. Ibiki frowned at the word out of habit. As a TNI specialist, he needed to be capable of understanding even the most obscure information, so certain laws on information control did not apply to him, which included the laws regarding Naruto and his demon, but long habit made him try to avoid that word. Slipping up and talking about it in public was a good way to get himself executed. If he does manage to escape, I suspect your interaction with him will be irrelevant to the matter. Kakashi sighed and looked down at the floor. He didn't need to tell Ibiki that he was disturbed by the request. The TNI leader surely knew, and probably felt the same way. You never gave a prisoner what they asked for. Interrogation was as much about feeling powerless as it was about actual torture, and once the interrogator lost that aura of unstoppable control, it could never be regained. But on the other hand, Kakashi looked at Orochimaru, smiling still at him. He hardly looks like he feels powerless, does he? As if thinking of him drew his attention, Orochimaru's smile turned into a smug grin, and he said to the glass and his watchers, "I would think you would be willing to risk a mere talk with one of the Sannin for the sake of your student, Kakashi-kun." Kakashi glared at the Sannin who could not possibly see him, then nodded to Ibiki. Naruto woke with a snort, grumbled, and turned in his bed. Unfortunately for him, it was not his bed. It was in fact much narrower than his bed. The difference in square footage resulted in an undignified tumble to the floor and an equally undignified grunt from the blonde. He rested his head against the tile and sighed. "Wait, tile. Oh no." Naruto looked up in dismay, already aware of his dreadful fate. He was in a hospital. The room was bright, white, sterile, and dead. You could taste how dead the air was with every breath. The room was a somewhat private one, with 2 beds curtained off in a single room, with a door and everything, which just meant people could die alone instead of in a group setting. And that lemon-scented cleaning fluid? Ugh! He heard a light chuckle from the other side of the curtain, and his face flushed. He got up, wincing at the small pain in his back, and stomped over to the curtain. He tossed the fabric aside dramatically, then stopped when he saw Haku grinning at him from the bed. The boy's right arm and leg were in a cast, and Naruto could see the edge of bandaging around the boy's chest from the cut of the hospital gown he was wearing. "Forgive me, Naruto," Haku said warmly. "I would have helped you up, but you can see I am in no condition to." Haku got no further before being suddenly silenced with a careful but strong hug from his blonde friend. After a moment of confusion, he hugged Naruto back with his good arm. "You okay, Naruto?" From Haku's shirt, Naruto mumbled, "I thought you would be dead, like the other guy." Haku smiled at that. "I was close enough, thank you. I hit a bench along the one side and tumbled from there. I'm lucky I came out as well as I did, I suppose." They stayed that way for a few moments more, then Haku sighed and pushed Naruto away slightly. "I'd love to catch up, but technically, I'm not aligned with your village, so I doubt they want me to be too chatty." Naruto was about to ask what Haku meant, then turned to see the ANBU member standing in the corner of the room, watching them silently. The ANBU stepped forward once he had both of their attention, stepping until he was in front of Naruto. "Hokage-sama wants to speak to you as soon as you are well enough, Uzumaki. He waits to see the extent of your injury before he passes judgment on Gaara of the Sands." Naruto stared at the ANBU, slightly confused, but that confusion began to fade quickly as the memories of the last few days. "Judgment," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. Kakashi carried a simple chair into interrogation room, sat on it, then leaned forward and rested his chin on a fist. "I don't suppose you want to explain what happened today?" he asked cheerfully, as if he hadn't a care in the world. Orochimaru shrugged, or did so as well as he could. Unlike Kakashi, he was bound to his own chair, carefully and completely. He had been compliant even since Gaara had been subdued. He was being so damned accommodating. "Why?" Orochimaru's lips twitched slightly, then lifted into his trademark smirk. "Because I have nothing to hide here," he said. Kakashi leaned back slowly and glared at the Sannin. It was obviously a trick. Kakashi was hardly a novice when it came to manipulating others with cold readings and mind games. "But I'm not speaking, so how does he know what I am thinking?" "Because I know everything." Kakashi's one visible eyebrow rose, then lowered into a glower. He thought of the one thing the Sannin would never expect, the friend he had failed. He thought of Obito. "Nice trick," said Kakashi with a disgruntled sigh. "I assume you're showing off for a reason, Orochimaru. If you're all that bored, I'll accommodate you. Any other little games you would like to play?" If anything, the snake's grin grew larger. "I would think you of all people would be more cautious with what you ask me, but yes, I have another game for you. How would you like to know what happened to Rin?" he asked, his voice filled with good cheer. Kakashi froze, the only way he could think of to hide his shock. The moment he did so, he realized that his inaction would be more than enough of an indicator of his interest. "You never did find out what happened, did you?" Orochimaru's grin did not fade, but he tilted his head down slightly, giving himself a more ominous appearance. "You ran and searched and hunted, but you never found her after she was taken away. Don't you sometimes wonder, in the depths of the night when you cannot avoid such thoughts, whatever happened to the girl who cared so much for you? Kakashi swallowed, trying to return moisture to his suddenly dry throat, trying to ignore his own sense of unease and resist the desire to walk away. Orochimaru had to have a reason to tell him about this. I suppose now you're going to make me an offer I can't refuse? Betray my country in exchange for whatever you pretend to know? Orochimaru shook his head and leaned back slightly, looking up at the single bare light bulb, staring at it for several seconds as his face went from cheerful to somber, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet. No, I think not. No bargain, no offer, no favors. Just a gift from one shinobi to another, from one of the few people who can really and truly understand your loss. Kakashi snorted, which elicited a chuckle from the captive. Yes, I suppose I am laying it on a bit thick, aren't I? Still, it amuses me to offer this gift, because I know exactly how valuable it is for you, and how valuable it is for me as well. But I won't force the discussion. It's on you if you want to have that certainty, or if you'd rather remain in the dark with your questions. Kakashi grinned under his mask. Sure. Tell me your fictional account of what happened. She's dead. Kakashi rolled his one visible eye. Of course she is. She never came back. Orochimaru nodded once. Yes, but not for lack of effort. She was taken away, then escaped. In theory. In truth, she was let free, with a deadly trap set within her that might well have decimated your village. And I supposed you killed her, Kakashi said, his voice dripping with disinterest. No. Orochimaru leaned forward, and his grin faded. She killed herself. I came across her, being hunted by shinobi under order to make it look good. Good to, say, a young jonin with a burning desire to keep her alive. The trap that she had within her was of interest to me, so I engaged her hunters, intending to capture her for myself. The girl didn't hesitate to step in front of my blade during that fight, and died with your name on her lips. He smirked at Kakashi. Can you imagine what might have happened if you had found her? If you had been tasked with ending her life to save your village? Can you imagine her blood running through your fingers as you pulled your arm out of the gaping hole you just ripped into her chest? How broken might you have been? Kakashi stood up and glared at the Sannin. You want to anger me? Me, personally? How does that aid your escape? Orochimaru laughed. Escape? Why escape? I've committed no crime. I even took part in saving Konohagakure, despite my past history with it. To do anything but release me would have a terrible effect on the world's view of Konohagakure. I can imagine it now. The old Hokage, slaying a former enemy now turned ally. I bet that would play well with all of his other allies, all of whom this village has gone to war with at some point in the past. He laughed at Kakashi's stormy look. No, this is a gift, the gift of certainty. She is dead. You failed her. And now you know her fate. Rejoice, Hatake Kakashi. I banished the ghost of uncertainty from within you. Sure, said Kakashi, his voice cold. I'm sure I believe you. Back to the subject at hand, what all does this have to do with my students? You mentioned this visit was for their benefit. Orochimaru shrugged again. We all know the penalty young Gaara will pay. He directly attacked civilians and shinobi who had come under a banner of peace. Mere deranked missions would not cover for this. You know what the more influential of the crowd will want, and you know that Raza will not object in any way. His manacles clanked slightly as he shifted in his seat. I wonder what Naruto-kun will think when they drag this container forward to his death. I wonder if he'll really trust the village anymore after it's all done. He smirked. Kakashi grunted. You're very convincing, pretending to care about my student as anything but a potential source of power for you. If it wasn't you saying it, I might have been inclined to believe you. But from you? Not so much. Whatever you're trying to do, Orochimaru, you know will oppose you. Bet on it. They both glanced at the door as Ibiki stepped in. Time's up, he said, his voice gruff but polite. He walked over and started undoing the locks on Orochimaru's chair. Orochimaru of the Sannin, you are to be freed from captivity. Thank you for your compliance in this matter. The Hokage requests your presence, Lord Orochimaru, to discuss resolution of this event and the fate of Gaara of the Sands. It was, in the end, a calculated risk, but one that Kakashi knew he had to take. Technically, it was a treasonous act, but Kakashi believed it to be the better of the two options. Better a charge of treason for him than risk losing Naruto and his unwilling passenger, assuming it ever came to light, and assuming the Hokage wouldn't agree with him anyhow. He slipped a note to Jiraiya, who had been waiting outside the ANBU headquarters in case he was needed. Jiraiya glanced at the note, set his face, and started walking up the street. He happened to pass Naruto coming the other way, who managed to keep his own face even when he felt Jiraiya slip something into his pocket. He nonchalantly turned a corner and pulled out the note. They will kill him for a demon, when he is not one. Don't let them set that precedent. Be yourself. Naruto smirked and popped the rice paper into his mouth. Not that he intended to any less. The Hokage sighed deeply and looked at the two men with him. Raza looked remarkably unconcerned about the meeting. He had entered the Hokage's office without a word and sat quietly, hunched into his chair, quiet and brooding. Hiruzen was not surprised, because there seemed to be no good path for the Kazekage. Reparations were almost certain. Letting a Jinchuriki loose in another village during peace was no small thing. Orochimaru, meanwhile, had been smirking at them from the moment he entered the room. He too was sitting quietly, his piercing eyes never leaving his former teacher's face. This also was no surprise for the Hokage. Orochimaru had largely prevented a terrible tragedy within a village that he was technically competing with, even losing a shinobi in the process. He had been seen personally defending villagers from the sand attacks, which happened to include many potential employers. He had cooperated fully with the investigation. The amount of political capital he had earned from this event was staggering. The damn transcript of Orochimaru's interrogation did nothing to help matters. Hiruzen suspected that Orochimaru had requested Kakashi's presence solely to ensure word would eventually get back to Naruto if they ended up executing Gaara, assuming it was not an attempt to subvert Kakashi himself by drawing comparison between Gaara and Naruto. Traditionally, Hiruzen said after a few moments of silence, the penalty for such a breach of peace is death, and in this case, it may be more a mercy than a punishment, to judge by the boy's temperament. It would be well within my rights to demand this, and doing so would lead to destruction. We all know this. Raza nodded at that. He could refuse, of course, and would have to do so if he wanted his village to retain its meager business. A Kage would never look so weak. Then the Hokage would have to choose between losing business and support from customers who would interpret that choice as a sign of weakness, or declaring war and wiping Sunigakure from the face of the earth. Doing so would be fairly easy for Konohagakure, but it would draw away resources and cost the lives of some of its shinobi. Konoha was still weakened from the last war and the Kyuubi's rampage 12 years ago, and the loss of a meaningful portion of its forces would invite other villages to attack. Unfortunately, the boy is also Sunigakure's Jinchuriki. If I were to execute the boy, it would happen here and now, and the one-tailed beast would be lost for some time until it reappears, as Raza has informed me that he has no container ready for it. This loss would ruin the balance now held by the 5 great nations, and makes execution a political bombshell that I am uncomfortable messing with. Thus, this meeting. I wanted to ask you too if you can think of any alternatives. Orochimaru raised a single eyebrow. You, Hiruzen, are asking me for advice? Hiruzen sighed and palmed his face. I have no doubt anything you tell me will be to your benefit more than anything else, and it galls me to make the offer. But I do remember how intelligent you are. Faced with the prospect of another shinobi world war, I'll gladly take your advice into consideration. Raza ignored Orochimaru's answering chuckle and spoke quietly. I can have a new container ready within a couple weeks. If it comes to it, we can leave him in his cell until then. Deprivation may weaken him, make the extraction easier. Hiruzen frowned at that, but to his surprise, Orochimaru was the one who replied. So, you want the Hokage to hold and torture one of your citizens, and your own child no less, for weeks. Surely you don't think that will go well? It's either doom on you or doom on them, and both have the same result in the end. Raza's head snapped around, and for possibly the first time since he arrived, he looked truly angry. Maybe you have a better alternative, rather than sitting there smugly telling us what we already know. Because right now, we're looking at 2 options, either he dies here, relatively quick and easy, or I drag him off back to Suna, prolonging his life by mere weeks and probably making him suffer more. We're trying to find a way to not kill your child, Raza, said Hiruzen, waving his hands gently for calm. There is no need. There is need, said Raza, crossing his arms and glaring at the Hokage. My village already runs close to starvation. Where other villages of our power have fully grown and active Jinchuriki, mine is still young, and slaying him to reclaim the demon will only leave us that much weaker. Another 10 long years before we can even pretend to be able to defend ourselves. And yet I cannot risk bringing the boy back with me. He's already shown a frightening degree of cunning, which is a fine trait for a shinobi, but not against his own village. He opened his mouth to continue, then stopped at the sudden thump against the door to the office. That door then opened, letting loose a flood of orange-clothed Naruto clones. They spilled into the room in a wave, all yelling and rolling and wrestling with things hidden within the ocean of orange. Hiruzen briefly saw the arm of his secretary push its way into view, only to have that arm tackled by 3 more orange bodies and wrestled away. Hiruzen distinctly heard a snort from his former student and glanced aside to see Orochimaru, with an otherwise stern look on his face, biting his lip and shaking slightly. Is he laughing? The flood of clones counted down to 3 in a largely disorganized way, and then with a shout of hup. They rose, standing on one another to form a tunnel of orange, through which Naruto walked in, his eyes blazing. As soon as he was in, one of the security ANBU moved in, putting the boy in a headlock and lifting him off his feet. Naruto did not kick or shout. He simply glared at the 3 old men. You know better than to barge in, Naruto, said Hiruzen gravely. You know that we discuss things here that, should you hear them, you might be punished. Like killing a kid who was only doing what they were raised to do, Naruto said, his voice cold. It was not a question, but a statement, and Hiruzen felt a moment of shame before he tamped it down. This is hardly the first time I've considered something others might see as immoral. He opened his mouth, ready to assign punishment and have Naruto removed, but at that moment, he heard a snort from Orochimaru, followed by a chuckle, and eventually, a full-throated laugh. He looked at Orochimaru and raised an eyebrow, and the Sannin at least had the dignity to cover his mouth as he laughed. Sorry, Orochimaru said once his laugh subsided. That was the stupidest, brashest, and quite possibly the most earnest thing I have ever heard. I would love to say I was surprised at your genin's attitude, but to be truthful, I have been waiting for him to snap since he stepped in front of my blade, and he did not disappoint. Orochimaru grinned at Naruto, then at Hiruzen. What if I told you there is an easy way to not only keep your strength and standing, but to enrich your village as well, Kazekage-sama? He leaned back, his face grave. I have a lot of work ahead of me, and my own shinobi are talented but relatively few in number, at least compared to Konohagakure. And while we are hardly rich as a village, I have more than a little discretionary funding right now, from my own efforts. I would not be averse to hiring the boy for a single long-term mission, a general job to assist me as I get my village running. Then, you retain the power of your son, at least on paper, and I have someone who can help me with my less pleasant jobs. You want the boy as a shinobi? Raza asked coolly. Orochimaru nodded. It's not like I don't have a method to control him, if need be. Hiruzen frowned. The idea of Orochimaru having access to a tailed beast, no matter how restricted or indirect, chilled him to the core. I find this idea concerning. Surely you're not considering sending the boy with my former student, Raza? You're no better off, and he's hardly going to be returned to you with any less bloodlust. You know some of his history. You can't possibly trust him. Raza frowned and leaned back in his chair, away from Hiruzen and slightly towards Orochimaru. I trust him no more than I do you, Hokage, but of the 2 of you, he is the only one that offers a plan that results in some gain for my village. It's easy to speak of bad choices over money when you have plenty of it. Orochimaru smirked, and Hiruzen gave a little internal sigh. Damn. The Kazekage was a man who made his own mind, as did most leaders, and directly questioning his choice only went to reinforce it. It was a mistake. And worse, it was a stupid mistake. Hiruzen was no political novice, and he was more than adept at dealing with narrow-minded and egotistical people. Why would he ever do such a damned fool thing? Hiruzen leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, trying to fight the feeling of weight settled upon him, of exhaustion. So trade us. Hiruzen opened his eyes and stared at Naruto, still dangling by the neck in the arms of his ANBU guard, glaring. He had forgotten the boy was even in the room, and now he was looking at Hiruzen with anger and determination warring on his features. After a moment, Naruto's face softened as the anger faded. You taught me to be good, Jig Hokage-sama. You taught me to be sane. So trade me for Gaara for a while and see if you can get him sane too. Raza stood and glared down at the blonde boy, who returned the glare. You are aware, the Kazekage said coldly, if we were to agree to this, you will be a shinobi of Sunigakure. You will not be some coddle child hiding in the shade of the forest around you. The desert has no room for weakness. Naruto grunted and crossed his arms. His body swung slightly in the grip of the ANBU as he tried to shrug, then stopped when he settled for continuing to glare. Raza grunted back, and the ghost of a smile appeared on his lips. He has spirit, he thought to himself, trying to make the boy flinch away from his look. Good. Worst case, Gaara snaps and gets killed, which leaves the village no worse than where it is now. I lose some face with this, but I retain my power, and it only improves the appearance of our alliance. He looked to Hiruzen and raised an eyebrow. Hiruzen wanted to refuse. It was a terrible deal for him, all the more so as he'd probably be required to keep Gaara's chakra sealed to keep the boy docile, which would render him almost useless as a shinobi. But as much as it pained him, he could not let Orochimaru get a hold of Gaara. Who knew what twisted things the snake could do or learn from such a deal? He glanced at the Sannin and saw his blank look, the one he knew so well, the one that said that he wanted nobody to know what he was thinking. Considering the man's previously jaunty manner, the change was telling. 1 year, he said eventually, looking at Naruto as he did so. 1 year, and we'll see where it goes from there. I'll need you to fulfill a few requirements before we do so. He nodded to Raza. But I agree. Raza turned to Naruto. Be at your main gate at sundown. Pack light. Orochimaru rose at once, smooth and fast, and stormed out the door, and made it almost down the hallway before his face slipped into a satisfied smirk. Not what I wanted, he admitted to himself, but it will serve well enough. Hashirama looked up from his place in his cell and smiled at his ANBU companion. It's been fun, he said cheerfully, his skin slowly dissolving into ash, but it looks like I'm done here. Tell Sarutobi to be a good little kid, and have a camera ready for his reaction. He sent a wink to Weasel, who nodded seriously. He then closed his eyes, sighed, and let his body dissolve once more. Gaara felt conflicted. Mother's voice had been very quiet even since he was captured. He could only guess that it was because of the restraints he was wearing, the same that cut off her power. And yet in spite of those restraints and the uncomfortable chair he was chained to, he felt good. The room he was in stayed a consistent temperature, instead of the sudden changes from harsh heat to bitter cold out in the desert. The single light bulb was bright enough to see, without glaring in his eyes like the sun. And Mother was blessedly quiet. They were enemies. They would kill him. He didn't need Mother's voice to tell him that, but everything was so quiet, especially within. Gaara fell asleep, and for the first time in a long, long time, he did not dream. He didn't awake until the door to the cell opened, and when he looked up, he saw the Hokage walk in. Then he felt a chill in his heart, because the blonde boy from the arena walked in as well. The boy he tried to crush. The boy he tried to break. The boy he stabbed in the back, desperately trying to get Mother to come back to him. She had left him. She always left him. They all left him. He's going to kill you, whispered Mother, her voice distant, faded. I know, he thought back. Go ahead, he said, bowing his head. Do it. He waited, and after a few moments, he looked up at the boy, who was unmoving. He was staring at Gaara with a strange, distant look in his eyes. After a moment, he walked forward, reaching into his pocket and drawing a kunai. Gaara shut his eyes and sighed. Finally, there will be peace. He opened his eyes when he heard the click of a lock, and he felt the weight of the chains on his body fall away, even though his arms remained restrained. The blonde stepped back and smiled. You'll have to keep the wrist things, but you're going to be free to move about the village. The Hokage walked over and put a hand on the shoulder of the blonde. Naruto here has made a deal with your father. You will stay here with us, so we can help you deal with your mother. Naruto will return to Sunigakure to work for your father until such time as you're ready to return. Gaara shook his head and did his best to take on the menacing look he was comfortable with, even if Mother was not encouraging it. I'll only end up killing you eventually, Naruto. I'll watch you bleed, and Mother will laugh with me. He cringed slightly. Without his mother's power, his threats rang empty, even to him. Still, the old man at least seemed concerned. Naruto stepped forward, raising the arm with the kunai, and Gaara flinched slightly, until he felt the hilt of the weapon pushed into one of his hands. A fist closed over his own, holding the weapon tight, and the boy, Naruto, pulled his arm up until the blade was pressed to his gut. I don't believe you, Naruto said, looking Gaara in the eyes, unflinching. I don't think you want to kill me. You might be willing to, if mother tells you to. And then she'll leave you, like she always does, and you'll have to kill someone else to bring her back, again and again and again. So, do it, and bring her back for a few seconds. Otherwise, try something else. Gaara could not speak. He could not even look at Naruto. His eyes were focused on the boy's hand, his hand, and the warm, soft hand that was touching him. No sand. Him. He only looked up when Naruto stepped forward and put an arm around his shoulder. I don't have much time, I need to get ready to go, but before I do, I need to introduce you to the wonders of Ichiraka ramen. It took only a few minutes to get Gaara and Teuchi acquainted. The old man caught on fairly quick and loudly proclaimed, any friend of Naruto is a friend of Ichiraka ramen. Gaara was obviously bewildered, but he was also quietly polite, which was good enough for now. It was a little harder to get Sakura and Sasuke to give Gaara the benefit of the doubt and put down their weapons when they found the two of them there, and they were more than a little angry that Naruto had signed up for the time in Suna without at least talking to them. Sakura in particular looked ready to snap. But in the face of a long time apart, they did their best to let the frustration go for one more meal with their teammate. We're having a talk when you get back, though, Sakura warned him. Naruto left them all with a cheerful wave. He was happy to see Gaara wave back, even if he looked hesitant and confused. The weasel-masked ANBU who was assigned to watch over Gaara and ensure both the boy's safety and well-being waved as well, causing Naruto to smirk. At least they gave him a guard with some personality. He dashed home and barely slowed down when he saw Kakashi sitting in his living room. What's up, Kakashi-sensei? He asked in passing, darting into his room to dig through his clothes. He pulled out several undershirts, and was just looking for some spare underwear, when he felt Kakashi's hand land on his shoulder. He sighed, and his shoulders slumped. I know, I shouldn't have jumped into the ring, but you saw, he stopped when he felt Kakashi's arm go around him in a firm hug. You okay, Kakashi-sensei? Kakashi let go and turned Naruto around, still crouched down to be level. I'm sorry, Naruto. When you jumped into the arena, and you tapped your extra chakra, I thought it was no longer you. Instead of trying to help you, I dragged your teammates out and left you with the monster. Can you forgive me for that? There was no begging tone, no teary eyes. Just a statement of failure, and a request for forgiveness. Naruto looked at Kakashi's serious expression, and after a moment, he scoffed. You may not have heard it, sensei, but I warned Sakura about the same possibility when it happened. I didn't know either. Besides, you got them out, which is all I wanted anyhow. There is only one problem, though. Kakashi shut his eye, ready for anything. Anything, perhaps, except for Naruto reaching up and tugging his mask down. He opened his eye, just in time for the camera flash. As he blinked away the flash, he realized he was alone in the room. Fading into the distance, he could hear the boy shouting, "This thing's worth 3 months' pay. Right before a trip too." Forgiveness granted. Kakashi smirked, suddenly light-hearted, and made his way outside to give chase. That's it for part 10. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.